Good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Oh, good. Okay. My name is Jenny Parker, and I'm the Vice President of Communications at the National Constitution Center. Welcome, everyone, to today's discussion on populism, demagogues, and constitutional democracy. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few announcements. We will be announcing our winter town hall program shortly in the new year, but I can tell you today for sure that our featured topics include the Affordable Care Act, the role of African Americans in the Civil War, and congressional term limits. And we will also be doing a panel on sex and the Constitution. To make sure, reserve those seats now. To make sure you remain in the know, please continue to visit our website at constitutioncenter.org/debate. And you can sign up there for one of our mailing lists. And you can also sign up on the survey that you received today for our mailing list, or better yet, become a member and support programming like this at the National Constitution Center. If anyone here is interested in becoming a member, please see membership and Rebecca in the back of the room. They will be at the check-in table during the program and after. And now I will introduce today's program. We will feature two conversations. On the first panel is Robert Kagan. He's the foreign policy expert and senior fellow at Brookings. Michael Kazin, professor of history at Georgetown University and editor of Dissent magazine. Nancy Rosenblum, political theorist and professor of ethics and politics and government at Harvard University. And John Yoo, law professor at the University of California at Berkeley and a visiting scholar at AEI. Directly following the first panel, we will have a one-on-one conversation with J.D. Vance, author of the number one New York Times bestselling book, Hillbilly Elegy. Please join J.D. directly following his talk in the main lobby, where he will be signing copies of his book. Moderating today's discussions is celebrated journalist and political commentator Peter Beinart. Please help me welcoming Peter Beinart, Robert Kagan, Michael Kazin, Nancy Rosenblum, and John Yoo onto the stage.
All right, so it's my job to moderate this conversation with this group of shrinking violets. Sadly, the news doesn't give us much to discuss, but we'll do our best. The title of this panel includes the word demagogue. So I thought it might be interesting to start by talking about what a demagogue is and whether our president-elect qualifies. Nancy, do you want to start?
Well, the phrase, of course, is Greek. It comes from the Greeks, and they were very concerned about demagoguery because the people made decisions directly in Greece. It wasn't a representative government. So the demagogue would stand up and convince them to do something, to go to war or to decimate the enemy or whatever. And so the Greek distinction was between the demagogue, who pandered to the public, and the statesman who led the public. And it's an interesting question whether you think that Donald Trump has pandered to the feelings and emotions and interests of the public, or whether you think in some sense he has tried to shape them. That is, that he actually created this rising of populism that we're seeing now. Did he pander or did he create? But if you go back to the original Greek meaning, the statesman serves the public interest, the demagogue serves the self-interest. We'll have to wait and see.
Bob, you've written some thunderously and I think powerfully anti-Trump pieces during the campaign in particular. Some of them I remember. Do you think Trump is fundamentally out for himself? Do you think that he is representing something in the populace that we need to listen to, or do you think he's a demagogue in the worst sense of the term?
Well, the easiest question of those that you asked was, is he out for himself? Yes, he's definitely out for himself. I don't even know whether he thought he was going to get elected president. I mean, he clearly is someone who has been in this campaign sort of gratifying himself. By the way, he's not the only politician in the world who does that. All politicians do it to some extent. But I would say he does it to a sort of remarkable extent. So, and I think engaging, this is the great puzzle that we all have, engaging how he will govern. I think a critical element is going to be, how does it reflect on him? And that's why I think he's somehow unpredictable, because how things reflect on him may have to do with all kinds of considerations as to what is considered successful or not successful. I feel like we are in a kind of Alice in Wonderland period. He's not yet president. There's a tremendous amount of speculation. He's taking some actions which look very conventional, picking some people who seem like very reasonable, are in fact very reasonable people that any Republican presidential candidate elect might have picked. But I think there are things in his history, in his personality, in the way that he ran, that we won't see emerge or tested until he is actually president. People start saying no to him. He starts being harshly criticized and opposed, and then we will find out what's really there. By all indications that we've had, and this is why I wrote those thunderous pieces during the campaign, his response to being criticized is to want to quash and crush the criticizer, which is fine if you're a private citizen. It's fine even if you're a candidate, although it's not great. As president, it's frightening, because the president wields enormous influence, and we have a panel full of historians here, and we all know what even really quite good people in the presidency have done with those presidential powers that have trampled on civil rights. So I think we are still in a period where it is good to be vigilant and concerned.
So you think he represents a genuine threat to free speech in the United States?
Well, as I would say, any president potentially represents a threat to free speech, because we've certainly seen free speech quashed in World War I, and on other occasions, and not just free speech, but people's individual rights. So you want to have some confidence that your president has a great deal of respect for norms and principles that govern the way we operate. And you can't simply rely, in my view, you can't simply rely on our institutions and our Constitution to protect all of us. You do have to have someone with the right temperament. To my mind, given that you do have to worry with anybody, you have to worry more with him.
Now, John Yoo, do you buy the idea that Donald Trump represents a fundamentally different kind of threat to civil liberties in the United States than any of his recent predecessors?
So first, I just want to say thank you very much for having us. And I'm from
the only polite person on the panel.
I was going to say.
I'm from Philadelphia, so it's a great chance to come home. I thought we were all going to come here to talk about a flawed selection process and biased media and cheating by the other side. I speak, of course, of Penn State's failure to get into the football championship playoffs. But to speak about this.
He's a panderer.
Yeah. I was going to say.
I'm trying to practice the demagogue thing, because the demagogue thing works, so I'm trying to practice it. First, direct response to your question. If you look at as Mr. Kagan said, if you look back at our history, we've had a lot of presidents who've posed threats to free speech, and it's been, you can look at the Civil War with President Lincoln, and World War I, World War II, but you could also look at recent history, Richard Nixon, but also if you're a Republican, you're upset with President Obama for the use of the IRS to treat the conservative groups differently. I think there's a lot of ability of a president to use their powers in the regulatory field, because the federal government has become so large, to pick and choose and play favorites. You're seeing President Trump do that right now with the CEOs of corporations, and it can go either ways. I do want to say, I think one thing I would mention is that I don't think the courts are going to save us, because it takes years and years for cases to work their way up through the courts. It'll take probably anything President Trump does, it'll probably take 2 to 3 years for any challenge to get all the way to the Supreme Court. So if there is going to be a president who's going to damage the First Amendment or free speech, they're going to get away with it for the first few years, unless there are people in the government who refuse to carry it out. That's where I think it ties in with a demagogue, because I don't think demagoguery or popularity works its way just through every 4 years in the electoral process. It also works its way in through the government, through state governments and through the federal government. If people in the government are willing to carry out what Donald Trump wants to do, even if they disagree with it and they don't resign, some of that will be the result of popularity in the Congress and the bureaucracy, then I don't think the courts and what we write in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, is going to necessarily stop them.
Nancy, you want to jump in?
Yeah, if I could just jump in.
Yeah,
I know.
then I'll go to Michael. Okay.
I don't think that the threat to civil liberties or to the free speech is necessarily going to come from policy from the executive office. I think that what we're seeing already is a kind of distemper throughout the country and a kind of intimidation and threat to people who write and talk that's filtered down into local levels where there's no guaranteed protection of free speech enforcement in practice. So it's not just constitutional policy, it's the temper of the time that he's, I believe, unleashed.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah, please.
You know, we've faced other times in this country's history where there's a lot of talk about demagoguery, a lot of talk about the Constitution being shredded, and they're usually times of economic distress, or times after terrible economic distress, 1890s, 1930s especially. A lot of people called FDR a demagogue who didn't like what he was talking about, believed when he talked about big businessmen being economic royalists who were unpatriotic, that this was sort of classic demagoguery of the left. And in many ways, I guess it was. And William Jennings Bryan, when he ran in 1896, was called an anarchist by none less than Theodore Roosevelt, because they believed that he wanted to scrap the Supreme Court's rulings on the income tax, other rulings as well. So I think, you know, for me, the charge of demagogue is sort of beside the point. I mean, as Bob was saying, I think every successful politician, and many unsuccessful ones as well, is in part a demagogue in a democratic system, like we have. The problem, for me, is the president-elect's policies that he wants to carry out, which I think will take us, well, they won't take us back, but they're the policies of someone who's a nativist and someone who doesn't believe that climate change is real, and I can go on and on and on without being too partisan about it. But for me, I think there's too much emphasis on those who are opposed to Trump, as I certainly am, on his personality, on his tweets, and of course on the reprehensible things he said and did with women, but not as much, at least not yet, on the actual policies he wants to carry out. Those, to me, are the real danger to the country.
So I want to drill down on that a little bit. So you mentioned his policies, the fact that Donald Trump isn't all that concerned about climate change, right? But almost none of his Republican rivals were concerned about it either, sure. Right? So I mean, am I hearing you correctly in suggesting that you think that basically you're a lefty like me, so from your perspective, Trump represents the same kind of threat that any garden variety conservative Republican would, a set of policies that you disagree with, but not a special threat of someone who doesn't respect our constitutional order, doesn't respect the rule of law in some kind of fundamentally different way than Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz or for that matter, George W. Bush.
We'll have to see. I mean, obviously, he has a sort of fan base, if you will, which is more enthusiastic, more committed than Marco Rubio would have had or Ted Cruz would have had. That's both a positive thing for him. It helped get him elected. It was a margin of victory in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan. But at the same time, it's also a drawback because it helps divide the country. It helps a lot of people who like Rubio, wanted Rubio before, 4 years ago, wanted Romney to be president, are very suspicious of this base as well. So I think we'll have to see to what degree he is able to keep his party together. Right now, it's a honeymoon period for the most part, and he's got fewer problems. Once he starts doing things on immigration, on trying to stop corporations from going overseas, that will be where the rubber hits the road, I think.
Bob, can I just go to what happened during the campaign that made you think if Trump is a different kind of animal who represents a different kind of threat than the politicians that we have seen in the past?
I'm having a hard time remembering exactly. So much has happened. But no, I mean, it was, you string together a number of things that he said and did during the campaign when he said, we've got to tighten libel laws so that, we can sue newspapers that criticize me. When he went after a judge that was hearing his case because he thought he was of some kind of Mexican descent and therefore was unfit. There are other things which we all remember, which I personally at this moment cannot remember, but a whole series of things which indicated that whatever else he's been doing the past 30 years, he's not been understanding how our political system works or respecting the various boundaries. And that's why, I can understand from a kind of battle over policy point of view why Michael would say, he's basically a garden variety Republican. And that's, in some respects, I think that's true because on specific policy issues, he's not going to be necessarily that different if anybody knows what his policies are, which I think we don't yet know. But I think what differentiates him from everybody else who was running, even people that I found sort of awful in other ways on the Republican side, it was this clear and sort of open lack of regard for sort of basic principles of how, of protections that exist in our system. Amplified by what Nancy said, which is this crowd that he assembled, which I think in an earlier period would have been called a mob, which was precisely what the founders feared, and which was, among other things, running roughshod over the Republican Party. Now, people may think, great, let's run roughshod over the Republican Party, but it was clear to me that Trump was assembling a force that transcended parties, which to my mind meant that he would not be constrained in the ways that people might traditionally be constrained. If you run as the leader of a party and the party helps you get in and you help the party get in, you're constrained to some extent. Most presidents are constrained by the need to help the party. This guy won without the party. The party is now at his feet. He helped them win, but it's not like Ronald Reagan. He helped them win by transcending them, by creating a force that was beyond the Republican Party. So to me, that is one further normal barrier to a kind of populist demagoguery and even potential tyranny that has been brushed by the wayside.
Except, Bob, he'll still need the Congress to pass things. He'll still
Well, but that's going to be an interesting question, right?
The bureaucrats all over the government to
forget about
carry
it.
out the
We
laws.
all know enough about the bureaucrats to know that they have, very little capacity to stand in the way of a president.
We'll see.
I'm sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I want to go back to Robert's point because I think it's so important that Trump is not a Republican. He didn't run as an ordinary partisan. He doesn't owe any debts to the party. And here's how he's different from any other candidate and the significance of that fact. Democracies depend on a party system, and in a party system, you believe that the opposition is a loyal opposition, right? It has a right to run for office. It has a right to try to do what it can during office. When it's in opposition, you don't try to crush it. Donald Trump went all out to delegitimize any opposition to him, whether it was Republicans or whether it was Democrats.
Or journalists.
Or journalists, to intimidate them, to threaten them, to accelerate the kinds of measures that would disenfranchise them. This is a man who does not believe, fundamentally, I think, in party politics. And party politics is the defining characteristic of a democracy. That's my fear.
Can I
Quickly, and then I want to get John.
Someone from Philly just described every person from New York City, in my mind.
I mean, John, do you think it's being exaggerated?
Yeah,
All politics is local, right?
No, my serious point, though, is I also opposed Trump during the campaign, but for very different reasons. I actually think when it comes to domestic policy, the president is Trump or Hillary Clinton is going to be constrained by a web of institutions that are created by the Constitution. A lot of what Trump wants to do requires the cooperation of Congress, where the Republican Party has very different policy views than him. And I thought what Robert was going to say is that it's foreign policy that really worried me a lot, because in foreign policy, the president's constitutional powers are really at their apex, and he can or she can do things without Congress's permission or cooperation. I mean, the president really does walk around with a guy who carries something called football, which has the launch codes, and President Trump can directly order commanders in the field to launch nuclear weapons. That's what really bothered me about Trump, far more than the domestic policy side, because in the domestic policy side, I think what you're going to see is Republicans in Congress, despite this early era of good feelings, I think Republicans in Congress, I wish Trump was a normal conservative Republican, because I think then he'd be a little bit more predictable. I think conservatives, Republicans in Congress are actually going to start pushing back on the Trump agenda because they don't agree with it to the extent we know what it
But okay,
is.
can I push back on this?
clarify
I want to push back on this, and then I'll go to because they may push back when the Chamber of Commerce is upset. But what's the evidence that they're going to push back when civil liberties are threatened? I mean, already we have ample evidence just from the period since he won the election that he is intermingling his personal business concerns with his interactions with foreign leaders. And I haven't seen a single prominent Republican Congress actually raise that as a concern. So where does your confidence that Republicans are going to stand in Congress are going to stand up to Donald Trump on those questions?
So first of all, those are two different things: the civil liberties issue and the emoluments clause.
This is a corruption. This is a corruption issue. It's a rule of law issue.
Yeah. So this is a separate thing, which is the difficulty that exists. It was under the Clintons too, and the Bush. You know,
So
how do you investigate? How do you investigate the overall?
That was equivalent to what Trump is doing, having his kids who are running his business in meetings with foreign leaders.
Has anyone ever heard of the Clinton Foundation? I mean, whatever you want to call it, the Clinton. I would say if I was a prosecutor and a foreign government did the Clinton Foundation, we'd be prosecuting Americans who gave it money under something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, because you were giving money to an organization with the. But it was legal, I think, under American law. I just want to say, I don't think that's as important what he's doing now in the transition, talking to foreign leaders. Maybe he's asking for hotel permits, maybe not. He's not president yet. Once he's president, he comes bound by the emoluments clause, and we don't use impeachment anymore. But if you look at the Federalist Papers, the framers were very worried about the idea that our presidents would be bribed by foreign countries, and that was the example they used for impeachment, not hanky-panky with White House interns, but presidents being actually bribed or giving gifts and money by foreign governments.
So you think that could be an impeachable offense?
It is an impeachable offense, but whether Congress chooses to do it is a,
right, that's
is a political
Michael,
question.
I mean, I think foreign policy is my main fear, and with all due respect, the president you served, did something that obviously a lot of Americans felt was an awful decision to invade Iraq.
Not at the time, Michael.
Not at the time, but in fact turned out to be. And if Trump does anything like that, anything comparable to that, I think that will be the end of his presidency, because Americans don't want that kind of presidential power to be used in that way again. I wish Congress would say, we should declare war when we go to war. It's something people sort of forgotten about. Anyway, but I think
that's a bad example, Michael. The Congress actually did declare war in that case.
Well, it wasn't actually
72 to 28.
It wasn't actually a declaration of war by the Constitution. Yeah, it was. Got around it. Anyway, I want to clarify what I was saying before. I don't think Trump wants to be a normal Republican, but I do, and here I hate to defend the system here, but because I am a lefty like you, Peter, but I do think that there are enough forces in the Republican Party and enough forces in the country to stop Trump from being the kind of autocrat he might want to be. And also, I think the fact that, I know you wrote about, use the F word, and I think when you wrote about him during the campaign, the problem is real fascists really believe something very deeply, besides in themselves, I believe. And also they want to do away with the party system. I don't think Trump doesn't have respect for parties, but the idea that he wants to, or could really have the possibility of doing away with the party system is, I think, pretty far-fetched. I guess I believe enough in checks and balances, especially against a president who is perceived as having followed a policy which most people don't like.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
So, I want everything you're saying to be true. I want to believe that the system is going to work and all these things are true. But let me just raise two potential pitfalls in this whole thing. One is something that I'll be interested to see what the Republican Congress does on one particular issue, which is, will the Republican Congress hold an investigation into Russian involvement in our last election process? Because if this were a normal, if this had nothing to do with anything, Republicans would be the first, the middle, and the last to be demanding an investigation into what happened in this electoral system. Needless to say, if a Democrat had won and the Russians had intervened on the Democrat side, I don't even have to answer that, but just as a general national security matter, which this is, because this is a major Russian tactic being used all around the world in Italian elections, in French elections, in German elections, and now in American elections. So the mere fact that Republicans you said no, will not do what they would ordinarily do is already a warning sign, it seems to me. The second thing I would say is we are 1 year away from the next election cycle, right?
Months, probably, not years.
Members of Congress are going to be running again. They were vanquished by Trump in this last election season. They may be vanquished by Trump again in the next election season, and they may not feel if he has gained popularity by getting 700 jobs in America for Carrier, by mowing drug companies into lowering their prices temporarily. Who knows what he's going to do that plays to what the people want? They may not be able to run against him. And let's not forget, that's what members of Congress want to do. They want to get re-elected. And they may not, therefore, serve as a check, except for those senators like John McCain, who I think is never running again, or senators who are not up that particular session. But House members are all up. Many Republicans will be up. And whether or not they choose to stand up to Trump will depend on whether they think it's in their political interest.
Right. I want to ask John or Michael to respond, because you've been playing the role of the folks who are a little bit less apocalyptic. But I mean, it seems to me we already have the answer to Bob's question about whether Republicans in Congress are going to make a big deal of Russian involvement in the election. They're not making a big deal of Russian involvement in the election. And so if that's the case, then what hope is there that they're actually going to stand up to Donald Trump if he violates norms that our constitutional system depends on?
Well, on the one hand, there are still Democrats. They have 48 seats in the Senate, and I forget how many seats in the House, 200 and something, 203 or 204, something like that. And the question is going to be whether they do what the Republicans did to Obama, which is saying, we're not going to support anything, we're not going to compromise at all. If he does something which is exactly what we want, of course we'll support it, but that's not going to happen. And that's a big debate going on right now, I think, in the Democratic Party. But the filibuster still exists. Not for everything. Harry Reid did away with that, but still exists for some key bills. It's going to be very difficult to really repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act the way he's talked about doing. A lot of people get hurt if they try to do it right away and so forth. So I think we're again, I say this as somebody who very much devoutly wished he had lost the election. On the other hand, I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that a guy who won 46.2% of the vote and is not built on that very much, if the current polls are at all accurate, is in this position to sort of do whatever he wants in terms of civil liberties, in terms of policy, and so forth. I think he's going to learn, as presidents always learn, that they can only do things which Congress enables them to do, except, of course, with foreign policy, which is where I'm more scared, to be honest with you.
Nancy, I saw you wanted to get in there.
Yeah, I think that the foreign policy side of it is where he really is unconstrained. And, and everything matters short of nuclear weapons. I mean, the world depends upon a sort of more or less reasonable, judicious leadership of the United States, and there's no evidence that he can provide it. On the contrary, I think he's erratic. I think if he's insulted, he punches back. And I think there's one other thing that inspires or is likely to inspire him to be unstable in certain ways or aggressive in certain ways as well. And I think that this was a piece that was missed in his popularity during the campaign. I think that one of the issues for Americans who voted for Trump was the feeling that America had been humiliated in the world. It had been humiliated in the Vietnamese War. It had been humiliated in Iraq and Afghanistan. When he talked about being weak and being a loser and making America great again, it had an international as well as a domestic component to it. And I think all of this fuels what seems to be his natural and unconstrained aggressive tendencies. And there the question is, who can constrain him?
I actually
John,
think
John, go ahead.
let me defend the system a little more. At least in the domestic area, I think Trump needs congressional Republicans more than they need him. Because if you look at the things that Trump lost the majority of the vote. He's going to be, every president, the first day they get in office, what are they thinking about? Re-election. He knows that he lost the majority of the vote. He's going to be trying to do those things to get reelected that are going to be popular. most of those things are in the hands of Congress. If he wants to do the big infrastructure bill, it's strange the media talks about it like Trump can order infrastructure spending. No, Congress has to pass a law for infrastructure spending. If he wants to change the immigration laws, Congress has to pass the immigration laws. If he wants to trade bills, in fact, he needs the cooperation of trade agreements. He can't pull us out of NAFTA unilaterally even because that was passed by a statute. It's not even a treaty. There's, I think, a lot of these priorities that he made, his big promises on that a lot of things are going to turn on, are really in the hands of Congress. And so you said an early sign would be an investigation into Russian hacking. I agree, that disturbs me. I hadn't thought of that, but the thing that gives me confidence, may not give a lot of people here confidence, but the thing that gives me confidence that Trump is actually looking to congressional Republicans for policy is the Supreme Court appointments. Because I was worried Trump was going to pick his sister, who's a federal judge, who sat here in Philadelphia, right? And she's actually a very distinguished, moderate,
and wrote a lot of
tough on
legislation.
crime judge. Yeah.
Right.
But instead, he went to the sort of establishment leadership of the Republican Party, and they gave him a list of names, and he said, "This is my list of names." And then they gave him 2 lists of names, and he printed them both as his picks. And the gossip coming out of the transition is that he actually is going to pick someone from. Now it's going to be a very conservative person. It's going to be someone actually as conservative or more conservative than Justice Scalia. Believe it or not, there's such people exist. But this is not his idea, right? He has, I think a lot of what he thinks about domestic policy is just really a vacuum, except for these high profile things in the campaign like immigration and infrastructure. And I think he doesn't have the ideas, so he has to get it from the party establishment and from congressional Republicans. So that's why I think domestically and foreign is very different.
I want to go to Bob on foreign policy, but before we go, I want to ask you as a conservative, how much does the fact, I think Trump was quoted as saying just yesterday or today that he wants Reince Priebus to give him a list of all the big American multinational companies that might be considering moving jobs abroad, and he wants to call each of them and tell them each not to do it, convince them, strike a deal with them. How much does that bother you?
I don't really, I don't think it's right to think that conservatives reflexively defend the Fortune 500. I've got no sympathy for big business or big corporations. On the other hand, Trump has no real power, no formal legal power to actually do anything to these companies. If he can persuade them, there's a famous book about the presidency that calls it the power to persuade.
But didn't he essentially threaten that Carrier's parent company would stop getting defense contracts?
That I don't think, so that's the thing. I think Trump could imply that, and CEO could say, yes, I'm going to keep a few hundred workers making air conditioners to be on the good side of the administration. But that's actually an area where the president can't pick and choose defense contractors. There's this whole process that goes into effect to pick, government contracts and what happens if you lose. But I think it's fair to say the president does have this kind of power to draw attention and publicity to certain things that make people sort of demonize them, whether they're corporations or people that have been targeted in the past, without any formal legal power at all. But that's from him becoming a political figure, not because he controls the levers of the government, I think.
Bob, I want to ask you about this Taiwan incident, which has been one of the most high-profile things. Different people have interpreted it in different ways. What does it tell you about Trump's foreign policy, the fact that this happened?
I've been trying not to answer questions at this stage of what I think I know about Donald Trump's foreign policy.
Well, what do you make of the incident?
And let me just respond. In answering this question, let me respond. I'm actually not persuaded at all that Trump is a mad bomber who can't wait to get into another war. I actually think he's probably the opposite. Insofar as he cares about the people that he brought along with him and created, they are anti-interventionists, basically. He didn't reverse himself without admitting it on the Iraq War for no reason. He thought that's what people wanted to hear. That is the national mood. That's what the Bernie Sanders vote was all about. Hillary Clinton was the only person who ran as a kind of indispensable nation foreign policy. Trump certainly did not. So conservative hawks are going to be disappointed in Trump because I think he's not going to be hawkish on Iran. And so this takes me to the Taiwan thing, which is interesting. I personally think that our policy toward Taiwan and China has been absurd and has made no sense, and that there's no reason in the world why we shouldn't be recognizing Taiwan. It's a flourishing democracy. It just held yet another in a series of democratic elections. China's claim to it is, I think, illegitimate, and there's no reason why we should have been bowing to it all these years. It's a bad deal that Henry Kissinger made eons ago in another time in another galaxy. So I'm actually in favor, in theory, with what he did. Here's my concern. I don't know that the people who advised him to do this, and it was Bob Dole, who the Taiwanese, if they haven't paid him $2 million yet, they should now pay him the $2 million. But whether they walked him through the next steps that occur after you've done something like this, because the Chinese go from 0 to 100 in a heartbeat. The Chinese are already furious and upset and frightened by the fact that the DPP candidate won. They thought the Independence Party in Taiwan was finished 8 years ago, so they're already in a panic about that. They don't show their panic openly sometimes. For Trump then to do what he's just did, and then when they complained about it, for him to zap them, there will be a cost to this somewhere down the road. And the way the Chinese deal with these problems eventually is to start doing missile tests off the coasts of Taiwan, or to start challenging our ships in a very frontal way. They immediately say, are you ready for war? And the reason that presidents don't do what Donald Trump just did is because they know that's where this is going and they don't want to go there. I don't know if Donald Trump understands that that's where this goes. Now, if you want to go there and you say, I'm ready for that confrontation, I think you can back the Chinese back down. But that is where they will go, and I don't think he has any clue about that. So while I don't think he's aggressive in the sense that I think you were saying, can he stumble us into these kinds of things because he doesn't know what he's doing? Yes.
My fear, too, is that he doesn't really care about what he doesn't know. I mean, going back to the 1980s, he ran these ads against Ronald Reagan on questions of trade. I think he does care about that for whatever reason. But he obviously, as we know, doesn't read about foreign policy, doesn't read about very much at all, has a short attention span, is affected by the last person he talked to, this kind of thing. And that means it's going to be a huge battle between his foreign policy advisors about who gets to talk to him last. And that's frightening on foreign policy, because as we talked about, the constraints on a president in the small kind of decisions about foreign policy are much less, kind of things we don't even hear about until someone does an investigative report years later about it. And that's frightens me more. I'm not afraid he's going to throw us into a war that Americans don't want, that polls show isn't popular. I'm more afraid that he'll do more things like this. He'll decide to talk to a government and praise the guy in the Philippines who has been murdering his own people for taking drugs, not just selling them and so forth. That he'll keep doing these kinds of things, and American and people around the world won't know what the policy is, and that is more frightening than him getting us into a war.
Nancy, I want to throw out a nightmare scenario and ask you how you think the institutions and others will react. So Donald Trump seems to have this instinct for understanding how to get at primal fears of people, right? So he responded to San Bernardino. It was after the San Bernardino shooting, that he called for banning Muslims from immigrating from coming to the United States, right? He had this, and it was an extremely popular view in all the Republican primary states. He had this instinct for where other people would not go, that he could go, that was very popular because it was based on fear, whether he believed it or could have cared less about it or not, right? So we have to imagine what happened. Let's imagine this scenario. There's a terrorist attack on the scale of 9/11. And Donald Trump understands that the politically smart move, understanding the primal fear of people and willing to transgress boundaries that others have not, says that every Muslim American has to go and come down to the police station and account for themselves and register and put themselves on a list. So I'm not saying that's likely. I don't think it's unthinkable. I don't think it's impossible. What happens if that? What happens if he does that?
I don't think it's implausible that could happen. I think, in fact, a lot of what Donald Trump has done and the lies that he's told are setting us up for a scenario like that. When he says millions of fraudulent votes, he's justifying a policy of voter suppression, right? When he says there's rampant crime rate is higher than it's ever been, he's setting us up for a kind of vicious, I think, law and order regime. If we were to have a situation that enabled him to do some of the nativist and anti-civil liberties things that you're describing, I think he would do it. We've already seen the conversations about that the Japanese internment after World War II was not a mistake, that it was the right thing to do, that Supreme Court decision has never been overturned. So it's not unimaginable to me. It's plausible to me. Will it happen? You know, I don't know.
And John, you're telling us that the courts are not going to save us from that.
Yeah, I mean, it would take a while for the courts to intervene. I actually have much more faith in the Justice Department, perhaps, than you might if something like that were to happen. I agree with you. I don't put it outside the bounds of possibility that President Trump might want to do such things. I will say, as someone who worked in the Justice Department on 9/11, there were people who wanted us to do that at that time, exactly the same thing. And people in the Justice Department, including myself, said we would resign. I mean, people will not carry out that order. Just because it appeals to conservative thinking too, because conservatives are not going to be in favor of taking away religious freedom. I mean, we would just say, well, what if we did the same things to Christians? It would be the same legal basis.
But conservatives overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump.
I know, because I think that I don't think it's because, I mean, if you look at maybe I'm wrong, but the polls seem to shift a lot, but I thought a lot of people were not in favor of banning Muslim immigration, all Muslims from immigrating in the United States either. I think it was more the dynamic you pointed out, that just Trump was willing to go to any means necessary to say, I'm a tough guy and I'll handle terrorism, and all you guys all you men and women are too consumed with political correctness to consider protecting the country. But I actually think when it comes down to policy, something like a Muslim American, or just Muslims of all kinds, Americans or immigrants, some kind of registration thing, I think there you would even see a Jeff Sessions would resign. He would not carry that out despite what people might think of him. And I think the people in the agencies would not carry it out. That's why I think these institutions really do constrain he does. Nancy's right. He says lots of crazy things that are flatly and plainly unconstitutional. But I think because of that, he really cannot expect the people in the government to carry them out. And if you do think so, then this is my ultimate solution. All the liberals should go take over a state. That's what we have. We have a federal system of government.
To take refuge?
Yeah, go take over, we
have California
Vermont.
already.
Yeah, you have California, where I'm from. Look how it turned out.
Well, we could go to Vermont. It's closer.
Trump will still have sovereignty over Vermont.
No, take over a state, put all the liberal policies into effect, create safe havens, and make the whole state a sanctuary state, and lead by example. And people who disagree with the conservatives will go move there and create the workers' paradise that Bernie Sanders, who's also a demagogue, would really want.
Right. They could put the internment camps there. Okay. So we have questions from the audience, some of which are better handwriting than others. Okay. All right. So here's one for you, Bob. Why do you think Trump has considered Romney for Secretary of State?
Again, I can make up a story as well as the rest of the world does. You've got commentators on TV making up stories and journalists, so I'll make up a story too because I'm here. But what I hear is that they think he looks like a Secretary of State.
That's what he said. Right. That's what he said.
Yeah. The generals look like secretaries of defense, and Romney looks like a Secretary of State.
He does look good. It's a good advertisement.
He's good looking. He's a good looking man.
For being a Mormon.
He's like the kind of guy you want out there.
Okay. Okay, we have a question.
Is that the end? Is that the end of the discussion?
It is the full extent of my speculation on the topic.
All right.
Isn't he also just humiliating his rivals? He did the same thing to Ted Cruz too. He made him think you might consider him for attorney general.
Well, only if he's not going to give it to him.
Yeah, and then he didn't give it to him.
No, if he doesn't give it to him, I will know exactly why we went through this process.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Well, it's also why he had Al Gore into Trump Tower and then produced Pruitt as EPA head.
So this is Nancy for you. We have a question about the recounts, which I want to expand a little bit
about
into the recounts that Jill Stein has initiated, which I want to expand a little bit into a question about whether there's anyone on this stage who would encourage electors not to respect the will of the people of their states and vote against Donald Trump on the grounds that he's unfit to be president. Do you think should we be encouraging that?
No, not at all. I mean, I think that we have to stick more firmly than ever to established political and democratic processes. Now, I do like the national popular vote movement, which is says we can't do away with the Electoral College through a constitutional amendment. That's too difficult. But you can have states agree that their electors will cast their ballots in favor of whoever wins the national popular vote. But that will be done in a regular procedural way through states making that agreement.
So you want to abolish the Electoral College?
I think so, yeah.
John, it seems like you want to rebut
That's
that.
why I'm destroying my electronics, because I had a quote,
Right, you're so
I had a
worked up about
quote
it.
here
So-
that I
so
looked up
upset.
about the well, no, because I find it curious that people who are worried about demagoguery that want to get rid of the Electoral College, because the framers created the Electoral College specifically to stop demagoguery. The one thing they were really worried about was the idea of having a national election for the chief executive. They thought that, and if you think about it, if you were worried about demagogues, you want to put in as many sort of anti-populist, anti-pure democratic mechanisms in the Constitution as possible. Right, so the Electoral College was originally designed to slow down and prevent any one person from winning a national election. The framers thought actually that and for a while the Republican primaries kind of looked like this. They thought each region was sort of put forward their best person, and then the Electoral College would have deliberation.
Favorite
which
sons.
they
They
don't.
used to have favorite sons all the
favorite
time.
son and now daughters. We don't do that anymore, but what happens if the Electoral College breaks down? If you look, it goes to the House of Representatives, where the states vote by delegation. We would effectively have a parliamentary democracy, because the Congress, the House, would choose the president. Now, if we were to adopt that system, which is what a lot of other countries in the world use, who would have won the election just now? Trump still would have won, or some other Republican could have won, because the Republicans dominate the state delegations and the absolute votes in the House of Representatives. So I think, right, if I can also say about this compact of the states, I think that's unconstitutional, because you need congressional consent to approve any compact between the states. And right, if the Republicans continue to dominate the House, they'll never approve a compact for a national vote. And in fact, if you're just a Democrat in the House, why would you give up the power of the House to pick the president in favor of a direct national election?
John,
Can I just say one line?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of claims going on about now the Electoral College enhanced slavery and it's racist. If that's true because it's anti-democratic, you got to get rid of a lot of the provisions in the Constitution. The Senate is also give half the legislative power to the states, where Delaware, right down the street, right, which you only go to buy liquor without tax, right? Why do they get the same number of senators as Pennsylvania or California? But the Senate is also extremely anti-democratic. Are you going to get rid of the Senate? Judicial review, the power of the courts to stop the majority? Are you going to get rid of judicial review too because it's anti-democratic? I would say if you're really worried about demagogues, you should be in favor of all these anti-democratic provisions in the Constitution.
I think, John, you're raising a really, really fundamental question, which is the right response to Trump to try to make the American political system more democratic, right, in which the risk is you have more power to populist demagogues? Or is it actually to accentuate the power of those institutions that John is talking about, which in some ways, which may preserve our freedoms, but which are partially anti-democratic, like the Electoral College?
Well, I think there's possible middle ground between these two positions, and you could do it without constitutional amendment, which is you could have every congressional district be one vote, which they have partially in Maine and Nebraska right now, and the states could do that by themselves. I mean, there's problems with that, of course, but there's fewer problems with that than there are with the Electoral College or the popular vote either. I mean, I do think there's something good about federalism to an extent, and I want to preserve that. Otherwise, as Trump himself said, if you have a popular vote, then everyone is going to spend all the time in California and Texas and New York trying to drive their vote, and poor Wyoming is going to get nothing. Nobody's going to care about Wyoming. And I think there's in our history something to be said for good ideas come from the states. They don't just come nationally. So I would favor that kind of, and also you could do it without changing the Constitution, which would be a lot easier.
Nancy, do you want to?
I wasn't sure how I felt about the national popular vote, but now I am. This is really convincing, because I think that there is another consideration besides the fact that it's in the Constitution, and I don't see that the Electoral College stops demagoguery if you think that Trump was a demagogue. I think there's another consideration, though. We've had 2 elections now in our conscious lifetime in which the popular vote has been
2 of the last 5.
Upended, 2 in the last 5, right? And I think that this creates disenchantment with democracy and a real dispiritedness. It's at least as important as maintaining something like the primacy of the Electoral College. And it gets worse and worse, and I think it's going to be worsened significantly by this election, the disenchantment with democracy. And change the national primary vote is hardly going to undo federalism. We have federalism everywhere in all of ours.
Bob, I want to ask you a question which is connected to one of these questions here. During I think one of the really striking and unusual features of this campaign was how many conservative intellectuals, I know you don't consider yourself a conservative, but there were a lot of people
Or an intellectual.
Or an intellectual. All right. Well, I might consider you an intellectual. But a lot of people who consider themselves conservatives, very high-profile conservatives, were adamantly opposed to Donald Trump, and people who would have probably normally supported the Republican nominee. Do you think that conservative intellectual opposition to Trump will hold during his presidency, in that their general orientation will remain critical, or do you think it will shift now that he's in power and now that he's in all these fights with the left?
Well, first of all, it won't matter one way or the other where conservative intellectuals are. Who cares where conservative intellectuals are?
I don't agree with it, but go ahead.
Okay. They had such impact during this campaign that, one can only imagine the continuing impact they will have during the Trump presidency. Look, I mean, most people, and if we're talking about Washington, most people in Washington don't like being on the outs. I particularly enjoy being on the outs, so it's fine for me, but a lot of people don't. And so they find ways to make their peace with whatever is going on. And when you see the number of people who signed the so-called Never Trump letter, who said they would serve for Trump, which is a respectable opinion, but nevertheless not one that I would take, I thought that was at the very least a willingness to come to grips, and the tremendous amount of what I consider to be wishful thinking going on among my colleagues about how everything's going to be okay. If only he'll pick Mitt Romney, then things will be fine. So I think that a fair number of them will find their way back into the good graces of the party, and we'll see. But that, like many other things, is just really unpredictable. The only thing I would say is most people don't like to be out there in the cold.
I'm actually quite stunned at how our conservative colleagues are running to jump on the bandwagon.
I wanted to be polite, John, but okay.
It always happens.
But, I mean, isn't it fair to say the same about liberal intellectuals in the Clinton campaign? I mean, didn't liberal intellectuals also feel like they were making a compromise with the devil, and she was a sort of establishment? No, I mean, did the liberal intellectuals really like Bernie Sanders best of all, deep in their hearts? He really wanted a communist revolution. No?
No.
Oh, okay.
You
mean all that stuff on Facebook's not true?
I don't remember a lot of liberal columnists who wrote columns saying they thought that Hillary Clinton was a fascist who represented the
just like she's just establishmentarian, corporatist.
Yeah, they disagree with some of her policies. I think that's different than the kind of things that David Brooks or Michael Gerson was writing about Trump.
Well, you're not going to see Michael Gerson going into friendly to Trump mode. I mean, Michael has been a real courageous figure and will continue to be, and I don't see David Brooks making his peace with Donald Trump either. So
I'm not sure David Brooks cares about politics much anymore.
I know, but that's not what David Brooks is about. Right.
Nancy,
I'm still waiting for you to mention the name of a conservative.
Or George Will.
Right,
and by the way,
George
Will, on the issue of Carrier, you're going to have to. Did you read his column today?
Yeah.
I mean, George Will does think that the Carrier thing is a quintessentially non-conservative action.
Right, socialism, I think.
But anyway,
It's true.
There's also Bill Kristol.
Right.
Yep.
Nancy, would it have mattered if the media had covered this election differently?
How differently? Sorry.
Well, you can answer that. You can answer that however. Or this is for anybody. Someone else wants. I mean, there's been a lot of flagellation of the media and some self-flagellation of the media, and a lot of, as someone who works in media institutions, a lot of self-doubt about the way things played themselves out. So the question is, do you folks believe that that this mattered in the way things played itself? Could the media have done something that would have taken us on a better, that would have led to a different outcome, or just led us to a better kind of discourse in this election?
I think that there are a lot of justified mea culpas on the part of the mainstream, both television and print media. We don't know, but I would be very surprised to learn through careful studies that the behavior of the media and some of its inane practices, like two sides and so on, influence the outcome of the election. I mean, if I were to pick something external to influence the outcome of the election, I would have said it was the Comey and the FBI.
I think
investigation
WikiLeaks.
11 days before.
WikiLeaks, I
Before,
think, may have been
and
even bigger than
WikiLeaks,
Comey.
right? Not.
But it was also the coverage of WikiLeaks and Comey, right?
Well,
Did you
that
think
was the dilemma that the press faced. I personally think that WikiLeaks may have been the biggest factor in this because it was just a nonstop drip of disaster at critical moments when, I mean, again, maybe she was never going to win, and our old colleague Alan Lichtman proved that she was never going to win. But I think WikiLeaks was big, and that was a real dilemma for the media. I mean, were we going to say to the media that because the Russians hacked this stuff, handed it off, and it's now being fed with a deliberate political purpose in mind, should you not be giving it the front page daily treatment that you're giving it? And I mean, are we really in a position to ask the media to make that kind of judgment? That's a very difficult problem that we face.
And look, the whole rise of Trump depended on him being on cable television all the time, on people talking about him all the time on cable television. And after a while, the Washington Post, the Times, as you know, began to say, he's lying. This is actually not true, what he's saying. But it took a while. And Washington Post, the Times, you know, are more important than conservative intellectuals maybe, but nevertheless, they're not as important as people who want to watch a pretty riveting speaker, as much as I can't stand his politics, you know, on television. And would it have made a difference if they had showed him less, if they'd made sure to show Jeb Bush's speeches as much as they showed? People would have turned it off.
And they wouldn't be in business anymore.
Another compelling speaker.
But, I mean, this is the first presidential election, I think, and you know, correct me if I'm wrong, in which, you know, through YouTube and other platforms, you could see every speech by every candidate, you know, if you wanted to. And of course, on cable, they were showing Trump speeches, the whole thing for very, very often. And you know, that is how he built his public, after all. I mean, somebody wrote a column comparing him to William James Bryan. It's a very bad comparison in many ways. But similarly, he became president because of his oratory, primarily. And if the press had covered that differently.
Oratory is a strong word to describe what he does.
You know, sorry, I could use people like to hear him speak. They went to hear they bought his baseball caps and they went to hear him speak, and you know, he was already a celebrity, and he became even more of a celebrity because TV helped him become that.
He was riveting. I just wanted to say one thing. If there's anything we've learned about media in this campaign, is that there isn't a media.
Right, of course.
They're various, they're divisive, they're focused. If you're on Facebook, right, the media you read is a teeny little slice of the media, and other people are reading other things.
We're just about out of time, but I want to end by asking each of you just quickly, is there, speaking to the people in the audience, and just what do you think is in this new environment the most important, one thing that you would suggest that citizens do to respond to this new environment? What's the most important thing what's the most important kind of behavior that you think for citizens now in this Trump era? Anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
You go.
Resist policies you think are terrible in all kinds of ways, intelligent ways. People like me on the left have to not do stupid things like use four-letter words and burn flags, or say he's not my president. The fact he is my president, that's the problem. And you know, get involved in politics. Too many people say, I didn't vote for Hillary because I didn't like her. I hated Trump, I didn't like her. So, you know, politics is not about who you like, it's about being a good citizen and taking part in politics with that consciousness in mind.
Well, getting involved in politics, certainly, but I and my friends, we talk about this all the time. What do you do? Right? And my first thought is that if these policies go through that he talks about, a lot of people are going to be hurt, right? And so pick your organizations. They're going to provide some sort of safety net and support for people. In my case, it's probably women in Planned Parenthood. But there are lots and lots of them. And I would say if you're not yourself an activist, that's something you can do.
John, Bob?
I just love the idea of people in faculty meetings sitting around saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Hopefully nothing. Because I don't want the academics in the world to run anything at all.
I don't think there's a danger of that.
Yeah, no, I'm very satisfied with that. I guess this is more the conservative in me. I think if you were a liberal unhappy with Trump, then you want to reinforce the existing institutions that constrain him, and particularly federalism. I think one thing we didn't really talk about was how the Democratic Party or liberals got completely shellacked at the state and local levels, to the point where, was it 2/3 of the governors are Republican, 2/3 of the state houses are fully Republican, and there's just maybe there's just single digits of state legislatures in Democratic hands. So if you are an opponent of Trump, you really have to return and start paying attention to state and local politics, because I don't think the Democratic Party is going to survive long if they just pick off the presidency every now and then and they leave all the thousands of other offices in the hands of the Republicans. Although I'm very happy because it gives my friends jobs. On the other hand, if you're a Republican and you're worried about Trump, then I think you want to reinforce the other institutions in our separation of powers, particularly Congress. One thing we also didn't talk about is I think that one thing that Democrats used to have and Republicans didn't have so much is they used to have a presidential wing and a congressional wing of the party. I didn't think that division was so much there in the Republican Party, but I think you could see it grow, because I think the policy objectives of the two wings are different in the Republican Party.
Do you want a quick last word?
A quick last word is, I would just say, I'm hoping for the best case that we've all hoped for, but the thing to do is to be vigilant for the worst case. And that means not just treating him like a Republican. You don't like his Republican policies, that's fine. But what you have to be vigilant for is when we're stepping outside of constitutional bounds. And for me, what that means is being vigilant about the groups that may be targeted in this scenario, because there are lots of them. And I think we need to be not just living in our own little cones, but to be very aware of whether there are groups out there that are in any way imperiled, and then leaping loudly to their defense, because that is what did not happen in the past. People did not leap to the defense of German Americans, Japanese Americans, and what have you all the way through history. That is what we ought to be wise enough to do.
Amen. Thank you very, very much, John Yoo, Nancy Rosenblum, Michael Kazin,
Thank you.
Bob Kagan.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stay and...